I'm so glad that you joined us for today's episode of Biblically Grounded. I'm your host, Clayton Van Huss, and I want to talk to you today about an artifact and how it helps to illuminate the text of Scripture for us. I have a very small artifact sitting on the table in front of me. In fact, it's really hard to see unless we get a nice close-up shot. But this little almond-shaped piece of lead, because that's what that is. It's a nice heavy piece of lead, and it's almond shaped or football shaped, if you want to call it that. This is a Roman artifact. The Romans left these wherever they went. In fact, it wasn't started with the Romans. These actually date way back because this is a Roman bullet. That's right. No, the Romans did not have guns. But what they had were slings. And the sling is an ancient weapon found all around the earth. Anywhere you find civilization, you find slings. In fact, I was recently in the American Southwest. I was in Arizona, and I went to a small museum, and they had a Native American Indian sling stone in there. I saw this round stone, and I thought, could that be? And the plaque on it said that it was a sling stone. And other than the fact that it was carved from rock here in North America, it looked very much like the sling stones that we find in the land of the Bible. And now the old stones tend to be chipped from flint. It's a nice heavy stone. It's easy to chip and to make into shapes for those who are practiced. It's heavy and dense, and it slings very well. An ancient slinger was very valuable to an army. Now, the Roman sling bullet is the evolution of that weapon. This piece of lead, sometimes the Romans used stone bullets, and I think you're going to find out about that here shortly. But the Romans would use stone sling stones, but they also carried lead bullets. Now, this one is very interesting. It has symbols on it, and you often see that. On one side, we have a trident. That's a three-headed spear. You see, Aquaman carries that sort of a thing if you're a superhero person. But that's a weapon. On the other side of this particular sling stone, we have a symbol that's kind of hard to make out. There's some nicks and bumps in this particular sling bullet, but it is a bundle of lightning bolts. And that is how they saw the sling stone. It would sometimes have snakes carved into it or scorpions. They were fast. A practiced slinger could sling faster than Nolan Ryan could pitch. If you're a baseball player, he would pitch, I believe, around 100 miles per hour, and a sling bullet would top that. A little lead bullet shaped like this football or almond was deadly. A slinger could hit his target at distances at 200 meters. He was deadly. That's 2 football fields. At 400, he could still sling pretty well. And so the Romans, as they went through Israel and they went to put down the Jewish rebellions that took place after the time of Jesus, these were the sorts of weapons that they would use against the fighters and the population. And so tragically, we do find these objects that tell us that tragedies happened to real people who lived in these real places in the Bible. And these are real events that happened to the people in the land of the Bible. We are privileged today to be joined by Dr. Boyd Seevers, professor of Old Testament at University of Northwestern St. Paul. Dr. Seevers, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's good to see you, Clayton, and I appreciate the opportunity to share.
Well, thank you for coming on. Now, to give our viewers a little bit of background, Dr. Seevers and I have excavated together at the site of ancient Shiloh in Israel. And Dr. Seevers has done some really cool work on some of the battles that have taken place there. And so we're going to be talking about the Roman attack at Shiloh. Dr. Seevers, what are we talking about? What happened? Why would the Romans attack a site in Roman Judea?
So this attack almost certainly took place in the summer of 69 AD. The Jews had rebelled against Rome in 66, and the Romans put down that revolt from 60. Well, actually, they got the troops gathered by 67, and then they started decimating the country in 60 from 67 to 69 when they worked their way south. And then in 70, then they got to Jerusalem and took out the city and the capital and the temple, as we probably all know. So in 69, the historian Josephus says that General Vespasian took the army up into the hills north of Jerusalem, which is where Shiloh is, and he conquered the regions. I think of them as counties, smaller areas up there, and Shiloh certainly fits into that. And then he made his way south to Jerusalem.
Okay, so we've got some historical writings that the Romans went through this area and attacked some sites during the Jewish revolt. So, what makes us think that the Romans attacked Shiloh?
So the one textual historical text that we were just talking about is the only thing that we have in writing about that. And then if you link that up with the finds from the site, it becomes quite evident that that's almost certainly what happened. You have a major, well, I'm going to say a major settlement, a village, a large farming village in the first century AD through the time of the New Testament. Lots of pottery, I think hundreds of coins leading up to right about 69, and then all of a sudden everything stops. And it was about 3 years ago, I was working with my students analyzing different groupings of finds. And when we were looking at the arrowheads and sling stones, it became evident that we had Roman arrowheads and sling stones right before the habitation there cuts off. So it became evident we had a Roman attack. And you dovetail that with the historical account. It happened in the summer of 69.
Wow. So what we're looking at then is this site. And of course, Shiloh is very well known to Bible readers. It was the first capital of ancient Israel in the Old Testament after the conquest, when Joshua came in, or during the conquest, and they set up the capital there. They set up the tabernacle. The Ark of the Covenant was there. And so it was abandoned at some point, and I think we're going to talk about that in another episode. But of course, it was re-inhabited, and at the time of Jesus, we do see a settlement there. What size are we looking at? Is this a major city or something smaller?
Well, if you want to go by numbers, the best estimate I have seen is maybe you had 400 people living there. So it was a fairly good size agricultural settlement. We don't have city walls at the time of the New Testament. They may still have been using the old Canaanite major wall that you and I know from the excavation. That was from 1600 years earlier, but there was no real fortification wall at the time. So it had been an unwalled, fairly unprotected, large farming village.
Yeah, and it's situated kind of on a hillside, hilltop, depending on where on the site you are. And so it's open. No serious fortifications during this time.
Right. So it would have been one of the many similar unwalled villages that the Romans would have attacked, probably scores, if not hundreds of them during those 3+ years that they were putting down that Jewish revolt.
Right. So the Romans were going through during that revolt, and they attacked, like you just said, a lot of sites. And what generally would they do? What was their process when coming to one of those sites?
Well, it was fast and bloody and brutal, and they left the place burned and probably nobody alive. They would come up to a site and determine what needed to be done. When they came up to Shiloh, they probably had some 800 troops with them. They had some artillery machines. They would have set up the artillery and started bombarding the front end of the hill as they approached from the south. And then after maybe 10 minutes of raining death on the front end of the site, then they set their infantry, heavily armed infantry, out, and it'd take them 5, 8 minutes to get to the first grouping of buildings, and then they would attack with their swords or gladii, I think plural is, and their javelins or pila, and they would kill everybody that resisted there. Probably more defenders would have run from that. in the direction they were being pushed. And in our case, the attack started on the south, so they would flee to the north, and then the Romans would just very methodically go from grouping of buildings to grouping of buildings, killing those that resisted and pushing everybody. And then when they got to the northern end of it, that was the defender's last stand. There was nowhere else to flee, so they probably stood and fought and died there. And we find a lot of these Roman weapons when we are digging. If I remember right, you found a number of things from that battle last summer in the area that you were digging, as did I and my team where we were. So there's a lot there because the fighting was the heaviest probably at the front end of the hill and the back end of the hill, and we're at the back end of the hill. So the
Yeah.
Romans would have killed everybody that resisted. When they got to the end, all males above infancy would die. The Romans would cut their throats if they hadn't died in battle, because they could be an enemy combatant down the road. So the Romans would kill them, and then they would um, sometimes they would just kill everybody, women and children and babies and all of that. And other times they would keep the women and the infants alive and take them back and sell them as slaves as a source of income. And then they would destroy the place and take what they wanted and could use, any weapons or grain or useful things, and then they would burn the place and just leave it a desert, a disaster.
Wow, this is a brutal situation. I know that as we excavate and we come down to this Roman period, especially this part of it, we do find collapsed walls. We find things that appear to have been lost in a panic, things that you wouldn't normally leave behind.
Right.
Maybe underneath walls, we find crushed pottery, coins, things like that. And then around these walls, we'll find, like you said, weapons. And these are generally the sorts of weapons that would either be lost or broken, because they're going to take stuff with them when they go. They're going to take their supplies, aren't they?
Yes, they will. Well, first of all, metal was valuable. And so any metal you would want to take back. It could be bronze, it could be iron. The Romans were very good at working with those things, especially the iron. So anything that they found of metal, they would take with them to be reused or fixed and reused or melted and then remade into something else. So whether or not it was theirs or the defenders or whatever, they would take those things with them. So when you do find valuables that were left behind, like well, you had 2 silver coins or something in your square last year, yeah, that probably got buried in the
Mhm.
collapse of that building or something to where they couldn't find that. So they would take everything that they found. They may not have been there for very long at the end of the battle. You kill everybody, you take another hour to, I'm going to say clean up, but finish up what you want there. Look for people who are hiding and kill them. Take the goods that you can, load them on carts, and then you head back to your camp.
Yeah, you talk about people hiding. We had, I know, in another excavation by Associates for Biblical Research, we there was a hiding system, and you've done some work on Kirbet El Makatir.
Right.
The site there suffered a similar fate, correct? And what did we find as far as the hiding system goes there?
So what we found there was a main cave, probably a natural cave that may have been expanded to use as an oil processing installation. You harvest your olives, you take them down there and you crush and press them to make oil. And it was connected to another cistern. Perhaps when they started to use it as a hiding system, they dug a connection to that so they could be hiding in this big cave and then still get over to get some water. And then they dug a third, I'm going to say cave, but more modest. You had a channel going to, taking a right angle, and then going to another opening where they could hide and even put a plug in there, hopefully to disguise it from the Romans, but it didn't work. We find weapons down in that main room as well as the one side room. We find arrowheads in that channel going over to the other hiding place. And then we found remains of, it was like 6 or 8 different people, ladies and young kids and whatnot. So people who were hiding down there, and the Romans went looking for them as they would typically do. And they found these people and butchered them undoubtedly.
Yeah, yeah, very, very gruesome. And at Shiloh, we have similar hiding systems down in the cisterns. I've been down in there, and there's you can see where the lamps were set. You can see the soot in the niches. But you can see where they dug and they tried to make places where they could hide from the Romans. Do you think this was very effective at Shiloh, or do you think this sort of thing maybe went the same way as Massacre?
I At Mocketeer, you have a much better developed hiding system. They even built a wall to try to make it look like it was a smaller sort of a thing, and then the Romans saw past that and got in there. Whereas at Shiloh, I'm not aware of those kinds of things. I think you had tombs, you have cisterns, you have places where you'd store materials, or I should say food and whatnot underground. So any place like that that you could hide, I bet the people took advantage of that. But
Yeah.
this is by the time the Romans attacked Shiloh, we're 3 years into this. And so they are very experienced at doing that. And they know that as soon as the battle's over, you start looking for these hiding places and you kill the people in there and you take out the usable goods from that. So I'll bet a number of Shiloh inhabitants died in those underground places.
Yeah, these Roman legions were quite the juggernaut. So you mentioned they came in from the south, where there's a gentle slope,
Yes,
and that it only took them a matter of minutes to push their way over the hill and down to get the last of the defenders. This is sort of an Alamo sort of situation, but without the fortifications.
right.
Um, how did you determine the direction from the Roman assault and the way they pushed?
Well, there were two parts that I started with, and then I turned it over to my friend, an experienced colonel from the American military who really developed it quite well. But when I first saw that we had arrowheads and sling stones, I had my student plot the sling stones and where we found them at the site, which we continue to do, as you know. And so it looked to me like the sling stones that didn't hit the buildings at the time traveled farther north. We're to me, that suggests we're shooting from the south in some direction, and we're shooting at people on the buildings or in the buildings or whatever, and then the misses go farther to the north. So my guess was that the battle moved to the north. Now, that wasn't a really very brave guess because the very natural approach to the hill, as you know, is from the south. That's what we do every day on the bus, and then we walk, the quarter mile or whatever it is up to the hill. So to think that the Romans probably approached the hill from the south is just the best historical guess, period. Plus, then you attach that to the military information, and I thought we came from the south. So
Yeah.
I sat with he's a friend, he's a retired colonel from the U.S. Army, and I showed him this information. And he spent his career planning and carrying out military operations. And so he has to go back in history and use different weapon systems, but the principles are the same. And so he could very easily understand how they probably carried out the battle. And then he was a very good researcher as well. So he read all that he could about Roman operations and logistics and weapons and uh, lays out a probable description of what the battle would have been like, even down to the minutes, because that's how he thinks. You're covering this time. What speed are you going? How long? How many minutes would it take to get from A to B? And so then he can lay out how the battle may well have taken place.
Wow. And that is, it's terrifying to think of this well-trained army. So the defenders, what kind of people were the defenders? What would they have been armed with? What would their daily lives have been like? Were these professional soldiers, these Jewish rebels?
No, the Jews didn't have very many professional soldiers. They had some militias. They had bandits. They had roving groups that would fight against the Romans or against the rich Jews that they wanted to take stuff from. So they could be quite effective, and so the Romans had to take those people out. And it's slippery to take out uh, terrorists or guerrillas or whatever, whatever you want to call freedom fighters, whatever you want to call people like that. So how do you control folks like that? Well, you take away their sources of support and supply. And if something had happened to the Romans in the area, then what are we going to do? Well, let's take out the neighboring villages to punish them and to erode the ability of the Jews to support themselves. So the Jews at the site could have set up some kind of defenses, some kind of walls or ditches or something. They would have had sling stones. We know that for sure. They had squared sling stones, cube-shaped weapons that they would have thrown by hand from rooftops or whatever. They had some poor bows and arrows. We found a few arrowheads of the defenders from that time period as compared to many more of the Romans, despite the fact the Romans collected what they could afterward. We have some of theirs. And the defenders probably didn't have much of anything for uh, armor or leather or anything, perhaps crude shields. They were badly outmatched in every way.
Wow, this is it sounds like it was a very unevenly matched battle. So
Extremely.
yeah, so the defenders, they're just people. They're trying. They're revolutionaries, freedom fighters, as we say, that sort of thing. The Romans. What kind of a person was a Roman soldier? As we think of the Roman soldiers, because if we know anything about the time of Jesus, we picture the crucifixion and different things like that. And in fact, one of Jesus' disciples was a zealot. He was one who was wanting war against the Romans. What were these Romans like? Who were they? What were the legions that were there?
So we had three legions in the country at the time, each of about 5,000 people. Maybe 600 of them came to Shiloh. They were Roman citizens, many of them, the infantry. You also had the archers and the slingers and the cavalry troops, which would have been auxiliaries from the region that the Romans brought in and paid them to fight alongside the Romans. They were well trained, well armed, well organized, and well experienced by the time they got to Shiloh. So they would have been brutal and efficient and um, well led as well. The Jews did not have effective leadership in the revolt, but the Romans did. They had a great overall strategy of how they're going to carry out the whole campaign. And then when they got to a site, it would take them 10 minutes to set up, an hour to kill everybody, another hour to gather what they needed to afterward, and then they go on to the next place.
Mm. So this whole thing was methodical. It was practiced. It was cold, not very emotional from the side of the Romans. Just go in, do the job, and leave.
Yep.
Wow. So, Dr. Seevers, in your studying, in everything that you've looked at, and like you said, we see it. We see the destruction as we dig. We scrape past rocks and find arrowheads and sling stones. Um, what have you gleaned from this spiritually, as a believer in Christ? When you see this scene that happened in the land of the Bible, how has this affected your daily walk?
Well, for one thing, I think a lot about the flow of history and God's sovereignty over the flow of history. And sometimes he allows very tragic things to happen. All these thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of Jews dying in this revolt was an awful thing. But it was something that Jesus talked a little bit about that would happen. And God in his good sovereignty allowed for that. And so God allows nations to rise and fall, theologically, peoples to be punished and whatnot. Um, and the good people die in the middle of that and get hurt by that. So as I look at things in my life or in my country and the flow of history and even the political situation today as things go on, I pray for goodness and for God to control things and have wise leaders and bring about good for the nation, my nation, our nation, and our people. But He's in control and He's going to let it flow as He knows is best, even if it's not what I want.
That's right, and that's very wise. Dr. Seevers, thank you once again for joining us today and talking about this horrific incident at Shiloh.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
I hope that you enjoyed our discussion with Dr. Boyd Seevers about the Roman attack at the site of Shiloh. It's a tragic thing, and yes, it's sobering when you're digging in the dirt and you come across remains of this fight and you think real people lost their lives here 2,000 years ago. But as Christians, that's not what Jesus teaches us, is to be cruel to others. In fact, when he was asked, what is the greatest commandment? He said, the greatest commandment is to love your God with all of your heart, your soul, and your strength. And the second is like it, to love your neighbor. What does it mean to love your neighbor? Well, it means to honor your neighbor, to treat him well, to do unto others as you would have them to do unto you.